Hej og velkommen til podcasten med mig, Zak Bream. Min gæst i dag er min kæreste Cecilie Bern. Velkommen, Cecilie.
Mange tak.
So that's my extent of my Danish. I thought I'd do the introduction today in Danish. How are you doing, Cecilia?
I'm doing very well. I've been a bit nervous for this because it's not my native language, but the introduction was very nice. Thank you.
That's good. I'm sure you're going to smash it. So, yeah, for context for listeners today, Cecilia is my girlfriend. We've been going out for over 2 years now, and she's Danish. Hence the introduction. So yeah, Cecilia, usually the way we start off is we get to know you. So I want you to sort of paint a picture of your background, like where you grew up, like sort of like what your upbringing was like, what your parents did. Kind of give us a sense what life was like growing up in Denmark.
Yeah, I grew up in, it's not a town, it's more like a village compared to the UK towns and villages. My mum works in an administration on a school, and my dad is a dairy engineer. I don't know, it's kind of a typical Danish family life, I suppose. Yeah.
I see. I quite like the small town where you grew up. It's like quite small. It's very wholesome. And how long did you live there before you kind of moved about? Because I know you moved a few years later. At some point.
Yeah, because my parents got divorced when I was 15, 16. And I don't remember a time before we lived in that small village. And it's quite nice because it's not where everyone knows everyone, but everyone on the same age at the same age. No, pretty much everyone. Which has pros and cons, I'd say. We've talked about how you in London, you're quite anonymous. So there's obviously a huge difference between our upbringings. I forgot the question. Sorry.
That's what I was talking about what it was like to grow up in those small towns. I think because I mean, as you said, I grew up in London. I think I've lived in a lot of different places. Like when I lived in France, we lived in a tiny little village, and I think the experience there is so different. Like when I was living in that small village, there must have only been about 200 people, and there was the main church, and there was the one cafe in the village that my mum worked at. So it's almost like everyone seemed to know everyone, or if there was some sort of event going on, everyone in the village would go. It was quite like a wholesome thing. I remember the one really fun event that I really enjoyed was once a month there used to be this gathering at the town hall where every person had to bake their own dish and then bring it. So someone would make a quiche, someone would make I don't know, a lasagna, and then bring it in. And me being a kid, I would just run about and just get all the amazing food. That was a fun thing. Did you have anything like that in your village, growing up?
No, not in the whole village, but we did have Vejfest. It's like the road you live on. It's about 10 houses, and all the kids we were approximately the same age, and then we'd all bring a dish, and then we'd switch up every year. Which family would host? It would be in the garden because it'd be in the summer. It's very, very it's very strong memories from back then, and I kind of miss that now. I want to do that in the future. Because we would be playing different games. I don't know if we played board games, but more be active games rundbold. I don't know what that is. You hit a ball. It's kind of like baseball.
Yeah.
So it's very nice to strengthen the very small community of the road.
Yeah, it is nice. I think wherever you go, you do end up finding some sort of community. Because I think when I lived in London, when we moved to London first, we lived in a block of flats, and there was some garden area connected to these block of flats, and all the kids in these flats we always used to go and play together, and knock on each other's doors and go downstairs and play. until I got an Xbox when I was like 13, and then I don't think I ever left my
Yeah,
house.
then you isolated yourself, yeah.
Yeah, that was it. That was it.
Yeah, because you've lived in different places in London as well.
Yeah, that's true. They're each very different from one another. Um, so yeah, I wanted to talk about like go past your upbringing and then go to like the gap years. So you like finish school and then you do gap years. This
Yeah.
is something that I found like quite fascinating when I first met you. Is so you took like a few years gap year, like 3 years, and I
Yeah.
think it's quite unconventional in the UK to take long gap years or any gap year at all.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas it's quite different in Denmark, isn't it? Do you want to tell me a bit about
Yeah. So I know that in the UK, as you just said, it's very few people, and I believe you mentioned that it's the rich kids
that?
that do mostly. Um, but here it's I don't have the exact number, but maybe like 9 out of 10 people that do gap years, and if that's 1 or 5, it differs a lot. That also means that almost every person I meet at my age have been to Southeast Asia,
Yeah.
and they've all gone to the same exact rock. Like like it's like to me personally, um, that exact rock is a bit like, well, I don't know how much experience there because it's overrun by tourists and
Yeah.
English people as well. So it's not really that authentic.
Mm.
But nevertheless, when you've traveled, I feel like you grow as a person. And for me, now I started uni. Um, for me, that helped a lot in just like feeling calm about doing it, like being at uni for like the education, and then not really minding what other people think of me. Like I aged a bit more.
Yeah.
Actually. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Because like when I first started uni, I was what like 18, just finished sixth form. I was
Yeah.
so like immature, didn't study at all when I got to uni. Just wanted to like socialize and go out. And it took me like a few years to even get the ball sort of rolling. Um, and as well, I think that it's nice that everyone like in Denmark gets to travel. I think it is quite a shock though, like because every time I come to Denmark, I'll meet people and they'll be like 28 and they're just finishing their degree, and like that's so like unheard of in the UK. I mean, I feel like it's perfectly exemplified. Like when you come and stay with my grandma, she's always asking you like, she's like, "Oh, you're starting uni now?" Like,
Yeah, what are you doing? What are you doing? Oh, she's so sweet.
yeah, it's quite funny. So yeah, so you started uni, and I want to talk about your job as well, which is really cool. Tell me about what you're working at the moment as.
So I work at a care home, and that's for dementia patients, like Alzheimer's, Parkinson, and people with brain damage. And I'm in the section, I suppose you might call it, where it's quite young people. And when I say young, it's like it's younger than my parents. It's not like 20-year-olds, but I think the youngest might be 55.
Mm.
And yeah, it's quite tough
Yeah. What
mentally, but
what were your
rewarding.
expectations going in? Like, did you think? Because I think immediately when someone tells me about that sort of job and that sort of line of work, I would be very like, oh, that sounds like a really difficult job to do, like emotionally as well. Do you think it met your expectations of what it was going to be like, or do you think it was harder, easier? What do you think?
I was quite scared because when I got there, okay, it's a bit complicated, so I might skip some steps here. But when I got there, I didn't know what it was,
Mm.
um, and they handed me an assault alarm. I was like, "What am I walking into here?"
Yeah.
And that's because obviously, if you forget everything about yourself and like you don't recognize any people, your routine is completely different from what you're used to, you get scared. And if you can't communicate your feelings, you're gonna physically react. I've never had to use the assault alarm, but other people have, and then yeah. So initially I was a bit startled by that, but that was only for like 1 or 2 minutes.
Mm.
Then it just, I feel like it's quite natural.
Mm.
Uh, and also, a lot of people say like, "Oh, do you have to wipe them and like shower them?" And I do have to do that, but I don't mind. I, I, I really don't care. It doesn't bother me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm honestly so impressed like that you do that because I mean, the most extent I've done that is like worked at a nursery and like the kids are
Mm.
so messy. Like, I would wipe their mouths and like clean their hands and stuff, but like one time one of them pooed on the floor and I was like, ah, this is the limit to me. I don't know if I can do this. But no, you're really good at that stuff, and I think do you think in terms of treating someone that is a dementia patient that how would you say it compares to like let's say you have a baby? I feel like I would know how to treat a baby and talk to a baby and kind of like interact with them. How this might be a silly question, but how different is it talking to a dementia patient to a baby? Like, is it similar? Is it not at all? How would you do it differently?
I think it'd be a shame to compare them. I mean, the only thing to compare is like, okay, I might have to help them shower, but the amount of life experience they have, they don't forget that.
Mm.
Like the stories they tell me, they might repeat the stories, but then sometimes they'll get more details. And we've talked about how they advise on our relationship, and it's very nice. We like it goes both ways when like they invest in me as well,
Mm.
and it's not like there's a lot of different ways they're affected by their illness. Some of them might be like they just need a bit of reassurance, and a bit of safety. Where it's like if they wander off, they can't find their way back. That's a classic. I feel like a lot of people know about that. Um, but yeah,
Yeah, because I think to be honest, I do feel a bit ignorant about it because obviously I don't think I've ever met someone with dementia, to be honest. But I think when I've watched documentaries and things, my feeling is always that it feels like they have no quality of life almost. And it's quite sad. But then, like you've told me stories about how like there'll be people that come in and play music for the dementia patients,
yeah,
and they get so happy, and that's just like so wholesome in a way. And it shows that I think even any state of mind that you can still enjoy human sensations, like in the moment, like the way I envision what dementia is like. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong or if it's just too much of a grouping sense, and I can't group them all like this. But to me, I imagine it as almost it's like your memories on like a 30-second timer where you you're looking at things and you remember for a split second you go to pick up your glass of water and then when it's in your hand like your memory resets and then you're like, oh, why is this in my hand? And then you just put it back down and like it just keeps like resetting, so it's almost like you can enjoy things in the moment like food or like music, but things that take more time like a complex something that's more complicated or something that might involve recalling a past memory, then it's quite difficult. Do you think that's accurate, or is it? What do you think?
oh, it's so different from like where is it the frontal lobe that's affected? Like what's the individual's I don't want to say problem. Like what area it's hard for them, where they're
Yeah.
challenged. When you say like picking up something and forgetting what you had to do with it or something like that, it's funny because like they don't forget how to eat, for instance. Like if you give them food, they eat, but then it's almost like the routine. They're
Mm.
fine with that, and like they can brush their teeth even though they might not have a language anymore. Um, yeah, and also the music. I feel like most people know, as you mentioned, the music makes a huge impact on quality of life, and also we have these different posters around, where one of them is very, very beautiful, where it says, the heart can't get dementia.
Yeah,
And that, yeah, is very cute.
that's really nice.
Yeah.
The other thing that sort of surprised me was that dementia patients are allowed to leave the care home. Like they're allowed to go and sort of like wander the city almost, and then come back. Like, how do they come back? Do they know their way back? Is that for people that haven't really got dementia as developed as others? Like, how does that work?
Well, they leave with their families. Like, it might be, okay, if they have to go watch a football match, or if they want to see their grandchildren, then it's like their family that takes them out. Takes them out. I don't think you can say that in your language. Sorry.
Sorry.
Leaves with them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the doctor. I don't know, that helps with
Okay, that's fair.
directions, yeah.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. I wanted to talk about your studies now. So you've just started university, and you've been there, what must be like 4 or 5 months now, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah. So you're studying religious science. I think for a lot of people, when they first hear that, they're not really sure what that means. Obviously, that's the direct translation from Danish, so it probably sounds a bit like we wouldn't say that in English. But tell me about like what that encompasses. Like, what is religious science?
Yeah. So, to most people that contradict each other, like religion and science, and from like around 1900s, that was where science was strictly connected to natural sciences, and that's kind of the area where you are, and that's where you feel at home, like you know what it's all about. So when I come to you and say I put religion in that, I could imagine that's a bit confusing. So what it is, I learn about sociology and psychology. Obviously, I learn about the individual, like Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity as well. And then we learn about like tribal religion and how it more of a context. That's a newer way of looking at religion. Before it was more the sacred and then profane, which I'm not sure what the word is in English, but that's like humans. Yeah, like the difference between sacred and then us. Whereas now it's more from context, like the social context. It could be the cultural context. We've talked about immigration, like how do you merge two cultures together, and then it might be two different religions, or it might be one religion that emerges to a society. For instance, in Denmark, where a lot of people wouldn't call themselves religious. How does that, like, what is that clash? And then you learn to understand pretty much what religion consists of.
Yeah, and I think it's a really useful degree to have, especially in the modern age where, well, I think throughout history, but I don't think it would have been taught as much throughout history, because now you have a lot of different religions coming together. Let's say in the past, I'll stick to present. You have a lot of immigration now all over the world, so you have different religions coming together, living in close proximity from one another. So having people that understand, it's important for people to understand each other's beliefs and why they believe what they do, and kind of how, I think as well, the other interesting point is how these religions are going to come together. Perhaps like if you understand where conflicts might arise, you might be able to get in the middle before those conflicts arise and sort of solve them. So I think that talks to one of the benefits of having a degree like yours, where you're someone that understands each of the religions deeply, or will do at the end of your degree, and then you can kind of sort of do things like that. Do you think, I wanted to talk a bit about immigration in Denmark, because we see at the moment there's a large migration from like parts of the world all over Europe, coming from like Middle East or Africa, and then different responses around Europe from that. What role do you think people who are getting your degree can have in society? What role do you think you could play in society with your degree in helping this process of people moving to Denmark or people trying to integrate into Danish society or trying to teach Danish people how to communicate well with immigrants? How do you think your role could be in this, or people of similar positions to yourself?
One direction to pursue would be the integration part, as you say. To go to in a ministry, school of ministry. Yeah, thank you. And you could do like Red Cross, like charity work, but probably a paid position. You know, like the more administration. You could go into HR as well, where it doesn't necessarily have to do with religion, because we also learn about like cultures. You know, well, religion is also integrated in a lot of cultures, but yeah, a thing that that was quite successful in Denmark was with a lot of immigrations, Hindu immigrations, in Denmark, where they immediately were allowed, or like they organized to build temples, and they were allowed to practice their religion, and that turned out to be the most successful integration.
Why do you think it was so successful?
Because they were allowed to well, live like they pleased. Like the integration, it wasn't stopped. The religious aspect wasn't met with not a denial, but where it's like, well, I suppose sort of a denial of like, well, you're not allowed to do that. You have to forget or like pack up that huge part of your life and maybe even identity.
So do you think that's a risk at the moment, and perhaps what's causing a lot of the conflict around Europe, is that Europe is asking, let's take people moving from the Middle East. Europe is asking Middle Eastern people to give up parts of their identity to move here, like perhaps religious beliefs or cultural beliefs. Do you think that's what's causing a lot of the conflicts between different groups?
Definitely. Definitely. But I also see, I see the obstacle. As I see, it's very hard to integrate into a culture that is significantly, sometimes even against the very values of your own culture and religion. In Denmark, when the war in Ukraine broke out, it was said from the Prime Minister, I believe, that, well, this time it's easier because these people, these immigrants, refugees, they look more like us. And this is taken out of context when I say it. But nevertheless, that was what was being said. And yes, it's true, it's easier to help people that are more like you because there's less factors that play in to make it harder to integrate. But I don't believe that would be enough to just turn away other refugees.
No, I think it is very difficult. I think the problem you have is when in the EU, I feel like each country has chosen a different amount of immigrants to take on. So I'd argue proportionally, I think the UK has taken very, very little immigrants, like refugees, compared to places like Germany, for example. Like Germany is known for taking a very, very significant amount of immigrants. Like, I think almost an open door policy up until like a couple of years ago.
Mm.
And similar with Sweden. And I think the problem with this is that because if let's say it was evenly distributed throughout Europe, this migration, the migration, I think that you would feel people would feel like, okay, it's just a small group of people, and then I suppose I'll explain something different to then further build on this topic. Every country has a national identity, I feel like. So every country has their values and what they feel like makes up that country. So if we take America, for example, it's like freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, the Constitution, all of these things, right? And when they feel like it's being infringed on, they feel a lot of people feel like that's their national identity is being harmed. So each European country kind of has their own national identity, their own sort of values. And as you mentioned, people from different cultures have different values to these European ones. So, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just different. So when we have a lot of migration because of wars and because of issues in other countries, it means that suddenly you have a challenge to the national identity, it could be argued. And this is easier in some places than it is others. If you take the UK, for example, like London, if you had a mass migration to London, you would basically see no opposition because London is so diverse. Like it's you wouldn't even notice. I feel like it's so incredibly diverse. Whereas Denmark is the opposite. I mean, like I go to Denmark and I've seen more blonde people in my entire life than I have in like a year in the UK. Like it's a lot. People are a lot more similar, and so if you have a large migration of immigrants from the Middle East, it's very noticeable. And when you increase that number to a significant portion where it becomes a lot of the population, I think that's where national identity becomes to be challenged. And I think you see this is like the problem of why you get a lot of these right-wing groups rising now in places like Germany or Sweden who are trying to fight back against immigration, because it's almost like they're trying to hold on to their national identity. What do you think is the solution to this? Do you think that countries should accept that their national identity has to change? Do you think that they are right to try and hold on to their national identity and say that immigrants should almost take on the values of that national identity if they want to live there? Like, what do you think is a good path to go forward to try and get the best outcome for all parties?
Oh, that's incredibly hard.
That is a very difficult question.
Yeah,
Just
and a bit
pick an
dangerous to answer
angle.
as well.
Pick an angle that you would like to take on it. Like, there's no correct answer.
No, but I do feel like there are a lot of wrong answers. It's a bit dangerous, but I'm still gonna give it a go. It's so hard because in Denmark, are we talking about Denmark specifically? Or are we talking about in general?
We can, whichever you find you would like the most to answer.
Right. Okay. Well, first I want to say that I think that compared to London, obviously we're not as diverse, but I still see more diversity than you do. Granted, I might not notice how many blonde people there are because I've always seen blonde people everywhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, in Denmark, we don't have a lot of religious people that would say they're religious. It's a lot more complex than just, I'm religious because I go to church. Well, spirituality is also religion, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's up there with like 70-90% of people believe in reincarnation. Anyway, that's kind of off a tangent. But, to integrate religions that, let's take from the Middle East, because we have primarily from the Middle East, like refugees, and Islam, which is the primary religion. It's not all that are Muslims, but that's a checklist religion, which means there are a number of things you have to do in Christianity or in when you're spiritual or nationalistic, it's between the lines. Like, you can't show people, well, this is what we have to do in order to be Danish and like be true to ourselves. And when you then talk to people that are like, well, these are the things I need to do to stay true to myself, it's kind of an uneven, both are, uneven grounds. And none of them are wrong. I think it's just about creating a space, a realistic space where you can discuss values. I would assume that most people, just because we are human, have similar values. But with my degree, we look into, like, for instance, it's very, like, a lot of people say that Muslim women are oppressed, yeah. And that is such a shame to just say it like that, because it's so much more complex and nuanced, because it's simply not true. In the more Western world, when we look at these, like, when we just pluck out different out of context situation, then it's like, yeah, that's okay. I see from my perspective, from my upbringing, from my culture, that if I was in that situation, I wouldn't feel that's nice. But maybe listen to that woman that's in that situation, and don't assume that you know better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think with that topic specifically, it's difficult because I personally do believe that you should be able to wear head covering if you want to, and it should be freedom of choice. I think in terms of the EU, I think where it comes into challenge is country specific. So I think in the EU or Denmark or the UK, it's very like people are most accepting of wearing like hijabs and head covering, that sort of stuff. But then when you get to France, it's completely different, because in French schools, I think the word is they're secular, like their secular system or something like that, which basically means that you aren't allowed to have religious symbols in a place like a school. So you're not allowed to wear a cross. You're not allowed to wear, like, if you're Jewish, you're not allowed to wear the small hats. I can't remember what they're called. And you're not allowed to wear like hijab or something like that. And that is very, very sacred in French law. Like, that's just a rule that you're not allowed to go against. Like, the reason why it's there is to, I suppose, remove any discrimination, religious discrimination at all. It's just, you're there to learn. You do this. We're not here to talk about personal religious beliefs. Like, you do that in your own time. That's kind of the ideology there. So that's a French belief, and it has been for a long time. And then you get a lot of immigration and people wanting to wear hijabs to school, and it causes a lot of arguments and problems. So I think that's an example of how you're going to see a difficulty in society specifics in the EU, like trying to integrate different cultures, when you have these so like embedded rules or like ideas on how things should be done, because that's almost like a French identity sort of thing. It's like that's a core belief of theirs. So how do you do that? It's a difficult thing.
I want to add something.
Yeah, go on, do it.
Because a secular country is... Denmark is secular. A secular country, this secularization is differentiating religion from state. I definitely agree with, like, it'd be hard to do a collective decision in the EU, because the countries are so different. And again, it's quite dangerous to move around in this field, because there's a lot of
I think it's dangerous because people feel disrespected and also passionate. I think any topic where people feel very passionate about, you're gonna get disagreements and you're gonna get conflicts. But I think at the end of the day, if everyone is respectable from every side of the argument and are willing to have an open discussion, then I think it's perfectly okay. I think the reason why we see so much conflict and so much eggshell walking along this topic is because of the lack of discussion around it. I think you don't see as much discussion. I mean, I talked about the UK, London specifically, being diverse. It's not the case in other places, and you do see a rising right-wing movement in the UK. Specifically, it's called like the EDL, it's like the English Defence League, which is a group of people who basically don't like immigrants and feel like there's a problem. I don't want to group all of their views in saying they just don't like immigrants, but they go on a lot of protests and marches about the Islamification of the UK. That's their argument. I mean, we've met people in the UK like that. Like when we went to Blackpool, there was in Blackpool there was a lot of poor areas, and there was a lot of people just in support of like that movement. And I think you see that because there's a lack of diversity. Like in London, there's a lot of diversity, so you don't really get movements like that because people are very multicultural. They're accepting of that. Whereas in parts of the country that is very white, and then they start to see more immigration moving there, they feel under threat. They feel attacked. I love that, like unknown, the not understanding it. Whereas if you grow up in a place like London where every person around you is from a different faith or culture, it's kind of normal you don't understand that. Like, for example, some parts of London where I drive through, there'll be whole villages of like Jewish people, and you'll just see hundreds of like Jewish people in their like traditional hats and the pigtails, all this stuff, right? I've never talked to a Jewish person in my life, still, after living in London like all these years. And like, I'm not scared of that unknown, I just don't know anything about it. Like, I'm a bit intrigued. If there's any Jewish people listening, please come on the podcast. And but yeah, no, I think multiculturalism is something that I'm definitely a big fan of. I think it's something that should be preached a lot in society because it has a lot of benefits. I think that what I'd equate it to is if you go back 200 years ago, people would have thought women in the workplace was ridiculous, or like they would have thought why they wouldn't have seen the benefit of that. They wouldn't have understood it at all. And when people argued for women to come into the workplace, they would have said that they probably would have used the argument on the lines of it's like woke. They wouldn't have used that word, but they probably would have used it. And I feel like I would equate that to the same now, where when people say, oh, we should get diversity in the workplace, and then people call it woke, I kind of see it along the same lines where it's like fighting against that multicultural society that I at least view as a positive thing.
Yeah, you touched a lot of topics there within a frame. No. I want to ask you about the like, you know, when you mentioned you drive through an area where there's a lot of Jewish people. What do you mean by that? Like, is it quite not segregated?
Segregated. It is. Yeah. London is very segregated.
But
and there's
is that like, do you mix? Like,
why is it segregated? The thing is, London history is very complicated, and usually a lot of it can be explained by wealth. So I'll take the 1950s, 1960s, for example. After World War II, there was a lot of labour shortage in the UK. We didn't. A lot of people had died. We didn't have many workers. So the British offered a lot of UK colonies, mainly the Caribbean, they put out a notice saying, come to the UK, join our workforce, and we'll give you a passport. So a lot of people accepted this invitation and came to the UK from the Caribbean in the 1950s, 1960s. But then you arrive to London with very, very little money in hope of a better life, and you realise, okay, where do I go? I have no money now. So naturally, you go to a poorer area of London where you can buy a home. So, and also you go where your friends are. You're like, where's everyone else that I know gone? And they all go to an area. So that's why if you go to London now, different areas of London are it's diverse, but it's also segregated because people have moved to places where they know people. So like Southeast
Yeah.
London, like Lewisham, Croydon, Peckham, Brixton, all these areas, like that's known for like being more black areas, and that is due to the history of people moving there
Yes, but
from.
that's the history. I'm talking about now.
You're saying why is it still segregated?
Yeah,
Or
what's your take on that?
I think it's still segregated. Well, firstly, I think that most people don't move away from where they're born. I think a lot of people live where they're from, live where they were born. Um, Secondly, I think a lot of communities stay to themselves. Like, as we talked about, different religions, different races, each have their own culture. And when you have your own culture, you typically stay together because it's what you know, it's what you understand. Like me and you, for example, we have a lot of similar values, so it makes perfect sense. Like if we want to have kids, if we want to like get married, like all these things, raise grandkids, build a family. It's like if you have similar values, like it's easier to raise children when you have similar values. Like you want to do that with someone you have similar values with. So
Yeah.
naturally, I think people who are in a certain community, like the Jewish community, they get married within the community and they have kids within the community and kind of keep that going. And in essence, live together in the same place. Also, it's nice. I mean, we're linking back to what we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, where we said about the French village or your hometown in the small village in Denmark. We had a nice sense of community there. I mean, you knew the people there. Did group events. Those sorts of things are very important to people, and I think those sorts of events are what you would see a significant amount of if you lived in a tight knit community like those Jewish communities we were talking about, like perhaps like Middle Eastern and like South East and like East London. I think that's why, at least.
Yeah. The reason why I ask you is because it might have something to do with the size of the country, but here, when that happens, where it's called like, oh, it's a parallel society, they're not integrated correctly, they're not, you know, that's a discourse for a lot of people here. And I'm not saying, I don't agree with that, but do you think that has something to do with size? Because it makes perfect sense why you would group with the people that have the same values as yourself.
I think it depends whether or not you believe that, like you're talking about that, like some, as you said, that some people would make the argument that people aren't integrated if they stay in their own groups compared to like mixing with other people in the country.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, not integrating in that sense. Because how are they not integrating? They're still living in the country. They're still going to school with other kids who are Danish, for example. I think it's a generational thing where this will sort itself out after many generations. Because when you have first generation immigrants, you've moved from a country and you're still fresh with your values. Like you have not grown up in that new country. Like let's say someone moves to Denmark, they haven't grown up in Denmark. They don't have any association yet with the culture, really, the values. It's quite difficult for them to integrate. But then if they have children, those children grow up to go to school. They grow up with Danish people. Then that child might have a baby with a Danish person, and then their kid would go to another Danish school, and it's almost like I think over time it dilutes and it becomes a whole again, and that now it's just like more multicultural. But I think it's just the the difficulty of that first initial generation moving there, and that's the sort of like the where the conflict arises, because it's so different. People haven't got time to adapt quickly to the differences in culture. That's where it's difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that. I see the idea of that, but it's not a one-time thing.
What, immigration?
Yeah. It happens gradually. Yeah.
I mean, maybe I have quite a long-term view of I feel like I have a very long-term view of the human race. Like when I picture this stuff, like because I'm in tech, I like thinking about like Mars and like going to the moon and
Yes.
stuff and all this stuff,
Yeah.
right? So I think for me, immigration is so insignificant in terms of the human race, because at the end of the day, when we go to Mars and we go to the moon and our species becomes an interplanetary species, it's going to be so insignificant with this immigration stuff. Like you're going to have all these different cultures going to other planets and moving together, that at a certain point it won't be like, oh, this is my country. Like it would just be so mixed. Like, you know, I know I just took a massive like.
Where does this correlate with the current situation?
Because you're talking about, you said that immigration wasn't just a one-time thing, and I suppose I took from that immigration is always going to happen.
You jumped to Mars.
I jumped to Mars because
Quite a big jump, yeah.
because you mentioned how like immigration wasn't a one-time thing. Because I made a point about how over generations it dilutes in society, where you don't notice immigration as much, or that the initial immigrants aren't noticed as much, because it becomes diluted. All the cultures mix together and become this one national identity. And then you said about how it doesn't just happen one time though. Like immigration, it will keep happening throughout the next few hundred years. And you didn't say it specifically, but that's what I took from it. It will keep happening for the next few hundred years, or forever potentially. And I think my next thought from that was jumping to the fact that I think eventually it will be so insignificant, because instead of having a country's national identity, I think we would have a global national identity where it's just the human race. I think we're already there in the sense that me and you have travelled a lot. The one thing you realise when you travel is most people think the same. They care about their family. They want to have a home and like be somewhat happy and have family and like look after their parents and all these things. A lot of people, wherever you go in the world, have very similar basic values, and I think that is like the human national identity. So like when we do go to places like Mars and the moon, and a lot of people live in all these different planets, I think it will just be a human identity. I think the migration might not be talked about. I think that's an interesting topic. What, do you think that immigration will be a problem when you have like moon colonies and like people try and move to a moon colony? Do you think it will still be talked about and discussed then?
I mean, we're all gonna immigrate then.
Yeah, but after like 200 years, we might have lived there for a while, and then it'll be our home.
Oh. And what do you say? Mars?
Anyway, yeah.
If it's still gonna be talked about, yeah, probably. But I think because as we've already established, humans want to be in groups. Like we need that for survival, and and that's also a thing with religion. Coming back to that, we've talked about Dunbar's number, and that's the number 150. And that means that you can have a relation to 150 people at once. And that doesn't mean their upbringing, all the obstacles they've gone through their life. But it could be like, okay, I know this person, I've worked with them 10 years ago, or I know of them. But with religion, you've already established core values connected to this religion. So you're in a much greater group, which is also I'm not sure how to say this, but like an attractive trade, an attractive, humans are attracted to that. So on Mars, Yeah, I think that will still be the thing. It might be called something else, but
Do you think we'll still have religion in 1,000 years' time?
yeah,
Do you think we'll always have religion?
always.
Why?
Well, I'm gonna see if I can boil it down. So there's different. The thing is about religion, there's no consensus. Is that an English word? Consensus?
Yeah.
Thanks. About what is true. So when we're taught at uni, we're taught about the old theories, where it's like we can all agree about on these old theories, but obviously there are aspects and factors in it that we don't agree with because we didn't know as much back then. But now, every scientist, every PhD student, everyone have their own angle to it. So there's not really a consensus. With religion, a lot of people in the field will say, in the science field, will say that it is like we've adapted, like we're born to be religious. We're born to have. It can be explained as like, attachment. What are they called? Attachment, like
Styles? Attachment styles?
Yeah, thank you. It can be about that. It could be Oedipus. There's a lot of different theories as to why religion is a thing and how it accumulates and survives. I do believe that we're born to be religious, and even though I know, or I believe that I know why different ways why you're religious and why you stay religious, that doesn't take away from religion at all. Just because I know, because for Christians, God is so much greater than, and the idea of God is so much greater than just, I'm religious because I was taught to be religious, and I'm religious because I need to be secure. That's it's like it's almost too little of books, and it's quite frustrating to be honest.
I think that religion will. I think the same thing as you. I think religion will always be about, for the main reason that I think that the human race will never ever be able to answer every question in the universe about like those key questions of what, why, how did we come from, like what made us, and like then even if we found an alien, let's say like we just found some alien race that made us, and then we're like, oh, who made them? It's almost like an infinite. You could infinitely go on, and I think for that reason, there will always be God and religion, because when there is an idea that cannot be explained, that is, at least to me, that's where God can come in as an idea, because it's something that you just have faith in, that you don't truly understand. It's just an idea that we accept, and we don't know how it works, and that there is a higher power that has done all of these things.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, even if you go back to like when Darwin's evolutionary theory came out, I mean, the church felt under threat from it. But I don't personally feel like Darwin's evolutionary theory was a threat to the church. I just feel like it just created more questions, for me at least, that meant we get further away. It's like, what is it? The Dunning-Kruger theory, the idea that
The more you think you know, the less you really know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I feel like that encompasses religion and science, and that overlap, and why the two are going to stay entangled almost forever is because, as you said, the further we get with science, the more questions we're going to have, the less answers we have. It's So that's your degree, and I think it's very exciting. Um,
Yes.
we're coming towards an end now, so I just want to talk a little bit about what your hopes are for the next few years, what your plans are, and then we'll finish up.
Hopes and plans. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is obviously you moving here next year,
Yeah,
because that's already settled.
yeah,
Um, in a few years, then I'll finish my degree.
Mhm.
I'm definitely gonna do a pit stop. Pit stop is like where I wait a year, maybe two, maybe three, I don't know how long,
yeah,
before I do my masters.
Mhm.
And I want to travel again,
yeah,
and I would love to. Well, the two of us, we've talked about going to either Nepal or Romania for
Mhm.
those volunteer trips, and then traveling. So I'm still very much on that idea,
Yes, absolutely.
but we can discuss that further.
Well, I can honestly say it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and
Yes.
thank you for coming on the podcast, Scylla. I really enjoyed it, and
Thank you for having me.
that's all right. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.